How do you create buy-in and engagement in a group when all you feel like is present is resistance and maybe critique and the feeling of I have to be here, right? So in other words, how do we turn mandatory into voluntary? And to do this, I want to unpack one of the themes of mindsets that people often find themselves in, ourselves included, in any given situation. But first, I'm Chad Littlefield, co-founder of We and Me. You might be using some of our tools like We Connect cards or other things to spark connection and engagement and make that easy for you and for your groups. So in this video, we're going to uncover mindsets that create both disengagement and engagement and resistance, and allow you to help allow your group to shift from a state of this is mandatory to I'm glad to be here, this is voluntary. And so there are a number of things. None of these are silver bullets. All of these are options and tools that wielded in the right way can help create the opportunity for your group to choose to move from being a critic to at least a consumer or a contributor, right? So I would say in any given moment, we're operating under the mindset of critic, consumer, or contributor. If you even want to extend that, curmudgeon, critic, consumer, contributor, and maybe even at the highest level, connector, which connectors are really people who become hubs for contribution. But to keep it simple, right, critics are people who are really comfortable pointing out what's wrong with something, totally uninterested in doing anything about it. Consumers are sort of the folks in your group or your organization or your team that are kind of just passively scrolling through life, right? They're kind of like not sticking their head up because they don't want it to get chopped off. They're just kind of there. They might be taking some stuff in. They might be learning some things if you're in a workshop or other contexts like that. And then across this very important threshold, we cross into the mindset of contributor, which is when someone is in the place and mindset that I am not a victim to my circumstance. The world is not happening to me. I get to happen to the world, right? I get to contribute and shape the world because our circumstances are malleable, right? We don't control what happens to us, but we do have choice in how we respond and adapt to that situation, right? The more contributors and connectors that you have in your sessions, in your teams, the less exhausted you are after a meeting, after a training, after an engagement with a group. And the higher the impact is also for the group. Now, the trick is you can't make someone be a contributor. We can't make anybody do anything, right? So ideally, we're creating opportunities for choice for people to choose out of the state of critic and consumer into the place of contributor. And the number one tool that I know to be able to do that is creating an environment of challenge by choice. The idea that I'm not making you do anything in this session, and I'm inviting you to choose to engage at a level of your own comfort. And my invitation is to stretch a little bit beyond because, and sometimes when I'm framing challenge by choice, I acknowledge the fact that you can be here and be present and just kind of like be on cruise control throughout our time. And that will very likely be more of a waste of your time than my time in this way. And so inviting you to participate at a level of your own comfort in a way that stretch and serves you. And so other language I use to frame that is take what you need, get what you need out of the session. If this session's not meeting your needs, state those, right? Bring those to the forefront because chances are you're not there to just for fluff or to play a game, right? You're there for some impact or purpose. And your impact or purpose is probably to serve that client, team, group, district, whatever it is, right? So challenge by choice is that number one framing. The second is this idea of connection before content. Now, the second I say that, some people will have resistance to the idea of doing an icebreaker or a warm-up activity or an energizer, which I get, right? I feel because most icebreakers, energizers, like warm-up activities are done without too much intention or purpose with the hope that they warm up or break the ice in the group. Typically, they're ice creators and cold ups rather than warm-ups. Now, my replacement for that, this idea of connection before content, is very different. It's much more tied to the purpose of why you're actually there and tied into the needs of the group, right? So one of the biggest ways to invite people to play the same game that you're playing is to get really clear about your intention And intention, the Latin word intentio, means to stretch or stretching. And I love that definition because intention is kind of like a rubber band or an elastic that stretches over the needs of the whole and pulls the group together. So it's not just, your intention is not what your goals or objectives for a certain time, session, or meeting is. Your intention is taking a moment of empathy to like, what does this group need? What are they facing? What are they up against? And weaving that into your purpose and stated intention for that time together. Because that allows people right there and then to choose whether they want to play the same game that you're playing. The other element is when I'm coming up against resistance is if you ask a group, and I'll do this exercise with some groups, and I'm not necessarily recommending this exercise, but just to share what happens, I'll do this exercise where I'll invite somebody to come up and stand and just place their hand on my hand. And then I start pushing my hand closer or more and more onto their hand, and naturally they begin to push back, right? So all I said was place your hand on my hand, but when I push, they push back. And our connection with people and groups operates in very much the same way. Human beings have an innate need to be right. Not just like a need to be right, like a need to be right. And so when you feel resistance and you push back and you push for engagement, the harder that group will push back and resist against that. And so for me, the alternative to that is when somebody's pushing back, it's very hard to push back when I completely move out of the way and let them move forward. And so the facilitation equivalent to that push and pull for me is actually going from content to process. So you've got content, you've got an agenda, right? And that's carrying along. And the same time that's carrying along, there's also this underlying process that's happening. And it's mostly silent, right? It's the dynamics. It's the either the proverbial eye rolls in the group, or the chuckles, or the ahas, or who the group is being, and how they're kind of taking this all in. Is it chaotic? Is it quiet? Is it really quiet, like dead vacuum, no energy? Or are there lots of side conversation, right? That's process. And so if I'm experiencing resistance from a group and I don't think that there's very much buy-in, I just take a complete break from the content and check in on process. And I call out the elephant in the room. The reason that phrase elephant in the room is a phrase is that everyone knows that the elephant is there and is present. And so it's not like by pointing out the fact that people look really unhappy to be there and really disengaged, it's not like you're sharing anything new with the group. Now, I might not say it in that way, right? So I might, taking a break from content, I might pause and just reflect and check in like, hey, my sense is that you were probably just told to be here and that by choice you would not be here right now. And you are here, and that requirement did exist. And so what can we do right now in this session to make this worth your while? Assuming that there is some way, absolutely, that we can spend our time really well, what would make this immensely useful to you within the context that we're operating with, right? And checking in and inviting the group to share back and to be a part of that engagement or that decision. Now that requires the flexibility as a facilitator, a trainer, a consultant to adapt to what the group is, to what you hear from the group, right? And so if the group comes back with even more resistance and said, I'd like to spend this time by not being in this room and going and prepping my lesson plans or whatever it is, right? You have to be ready, and because you've asked and checked in with process, you've got to be ready to and responsible to handle whatever they throw at you. Now, chances are, if your intention in checking with them is not to play gotcha or like slap them on the wrist, if your intention is to actually create a meaningful gathering together, they'll probably welcome that shift or that change. So those are a couple ways. A couple other nuanced little tricks, phrases that might be useful. One of my favorite facilitator questions is, what struck you about that conversation? Or what struck you about that experience? Or what strikes you about this? And the reason it's one of my favorites is that it allows people who are dominantly process the world through data and logic, right? Brain heavy thinkers to answer that question, what struck you? But it also allows people who tend to experience the world through emotions and feelings and stories and senses to be able to answer that question as well. And so having little questions like that that are allow everyone to answer, no matter what mindset they're in, no matter what their personality is useful. So what struck you is one that I tuck in my back pocket. And then, when I'm using We Connect cards or inviting people into connection before content, asking them to answer a question that they otherwise would probably never have answered, I'm also reminding them that questions are like a key that unlocks something inside our lifetime of ungoogleable experience. And the cool part about that is it's more like a janitor's master key that unlocks lots of doors. So if somebody asks you a question, the way that challenge by choice comes into the frame here is that you have 100% autonomy in how you answer that question. Right? You have 100% autonomy in how you, and so if you see this question and you want to say, I took a class once and I learned how to add and multiply, and that's been useful. That it might be true and authentic for you and totally an acceptable answer. You can also share something more personal or impactful or real for you, and any of your answers are totally acceptable. And reminding people that they have total choice. Typically what I notice is that especially curmudgeons and critics and consumers do not like to be controlled or guided. No human really does. And so when we give people and remind them that they have autonomy, typically they choose the more challenging route. It's the reason that challenge by choice, that phrase, is sandwiched together. Hope this is useful. Obviously, none of these are silver bullets, but hopefully it's some useful thoughts. Thinking about diving from content down to process, pointing out the elephant in the room, steering into that curve rather than avoiding it. Having the empathy to state an intention that includes somebody else's needs, right? Remembering that the root of intent comes from the Latin to stretch, right? You want to stretch over the needs of the group rather than just keep them your goals and objectives and agenda for the session. And then I'm also thinking about the language that you're using, asking questions like what struck you to debrief rather than how'd you feel about that or what'd you think about that? Because you can assume that half the group will turn off when you ask a question that is only geared toward one of those groups. Hope this is useful. Per usual, you're welcome to drop into www.weand.me/ideas to get a bunch of free resources on how to make connection and engagement easy. Lovely spending some cyberspace with you, and catch you next time. Have an awesome day.